Why do so many of the best women in modern fantasy anime feel kind of weird? And why is that exactly what makes them feel so human? Because anime has never exactly had a shortage of weird female characters, so weirdness itself isn't anything new. But with characters like Mao Mao, Frieren, Marcel, Coco, or even Fern, I never really get the sense that those stranger parts of their personalities are being shaped around what the audience is supposed to like. I started noticing this around 3 years ago, when in a strangely short period of time, the Apothecary Diaries, Frieren, and Dungeon Meshi all came out. 3 anime doing completely different things, but for some reason I kept having the same reaction to the woman at the center of them. I liked these characters, and a lot of people did, but it never really felt like being likable was the first thing the story cared about. They didn't even have that much in common, and in many ways, they weren't appealing for the same reasons either. So the more I thought about it, the harder it became to explain what exactly these stories were doing differently. And I kept coming back to the same question. What are we actually supposed to want from this character? Every character is made for an audience, so I don't mean that in the most literal sense. What I'm more interested in is where that appeal seems to come from. Because sometimes, you can look at a character and almost work backwards from the reaction you are supposed to have to them. Anime is especially comfortable with this. Sometimes you meet a character, and pretty quickly you understand what the story wants you to feel about her. She might be immediately adorable, or maybe there is already some romantic fantasy taking shape before you really know much about her at all. To be fair, some of my favorite characters start from incredibly obvious archetypes too, which made the difference a little harder to pin down. Sometimes even the flaws can work this way. You get a character who's genuinely difficult, except after a while you realize difficulty itself is part of what you're supposed to find charming. At that point, flaws can start feeling strangely curated. They complicate the character without ever really threatening the appeal. Mao Mao made this much easier for me to understand. In episode 4, there is a scene I ended up making an entire video about, where Mao Mao realizes an attendant has continued using the face powder that's making one of the concubines sick, and she slaps her. It's such a strong reaction compared to how controlled she'd been up until that point, but it never feels like the show suddenly changed her personality for the sake of drama. From Mao Mao's perspective, this is unbelievably stupid. Someone has been told exactly what's making this woman sick and keeps doing it anyway. So for a moment, all of that usual restraint just disappears. What stuck with me about that scene is how little it seemed to care about making the reaction pleasant. Mao Mao is genuinely pissed off, and the show just lets her sit in that anger for a moment. I think that's what finally made the difference clear to me. Mao Mao is appealing. I just never get the sense that the story is checking every reaction against whether we will like it first. You get the impression it figured out who she was and trusted that we'd find something to like afterward. And I think that's why she feels so human. She gets to react like Mao Mao even when that reaction isn't especially pleasant. Which is where weird starts becoming the wrong word for what I'm actually talking about. So what do I mean when I call these women weird? Part of it is that they don't always behave like they are protecting one clean idea of who they are supposed to be. Someone can be mature and then get embarrassingly petty over something small. And when it's someone you actually know, you don't really stop to question which version is real, because both of them are. With Frieren, I always think about this tiny moment pretty early on. After Stark defeats the dragon, she suddenly starts running toward the nest because she's excited about whatever is inside. I think it's one of the first time we really see her openly excited about anything, which made the fact that it was the contents of a dragon's nest even better. Most of the time that distance is funny, but every so often it leaves her completely out of step with somebody she actually cares about. Even Frieren probably makes this sound more eccentric than I mean it to. Marcel is almost the opposite. When Dungeon Meshi started, I thought there was a chance she'd just become the person whose job was to tell Laios no every time he wanted to eat something insane. And I could see why. Most of the time Laios really does sound like he's lost his mind. Then the show just keeps giving her more room than that. She's still horrified by half of Laios' ideas, but when something really matters to her, she can completely lose it. And somehow, it still feels completely like Marcel. That's kind of how people work, and none of it really requires someone to be eccentric. And once you get to Coco, even eccentricity feels like the wrong direction entirely. A lot of what stands out about her is how sincerely she can still be amazed by magic everyone around her has learned to treat as ordinary, and the story never really asks her to grow out of that. she enters this much bigger magical world, and somehow that only gives her more things to be excited about. At that point, weird starts feeling less like a description and more like what happens when these characters are given enough room to become harder to predict. That also made strength a little harder for me to treat as an answer. Does a good female character need to be strong? Because for a long time, strong female character almost became shorthand for a well-written one. It was pushing back against a very real kind of character who could technically be important to the story while still spending most of it waiting for somebody else to make a decision. Over time though, I think strength started doing a lot more work than it was supposed to. Somewhere along the way, it became almost prescriptive. This vague way of deciding whether a woman was being written correctly. Suddenly needing help could mean she wasn't independent enough, or caring too much about romance could become evidence that the story had somehow failed her. And I think that's where the whole idea starts getting a little strange, because those are completely normal things for a person to do. Which is probably why I don't remember ever liking Kagome, because I thought she was a strong female character. I just really liked Kagome. She had her own opinions about what was happening around her, and even when she got scared or completely out of depth, none of it ever seemed to threaten the fact that she was still her own person. Korra is funny because she basically proves the opposite can work too. She is strong in the most obvious possible sense, and I always really liked her as a character, probably more than a lot of the people I eventually saw talking about her online. I think I got kind of lucky there, because The Legend of Korra was just something airing on the TV when I was a kid, so I got to form my own opinion of her before I had any idea what the general conversation around her was. By the time I did, it always felt like some of the disappointment came from wanting another rank, which I never really understood because who would want the same story again? Korra likes being powerful. A huge amount of her confidence comes from this very real sense of her own capability. And that is part of what makes her interesting. There are moments where some of her flaws feel pushed a little harder than I would have liked, but when those moments don't work for me, it has basically nothing to do with Korra being strong. Sometimes I can just feel the story pushing her toward a reaction a little harder than I want it to. So I don't know how much those traits really tell you on their own. With both characters, they just feel like part of who they were. That made archetypes a little harder to blame too. So when does an archetype become a problem? Anime has always been pretty comfortable with characters you understand quickly. You meet someone, get a sense of who they are within a couple of scenes, and that first impression gives the story something easy to work from while you are still learning the rest of the cast. I don't really see that as a weakness on its own, because a lot of characters I love start from something incredibly recognizable. Clannad is a good example of that. A lot of its cast is introduced in ways that feel almost exaggerated at first, and Kyo is very easy to read when you meet her. If that was all the story ever wanted from her, it probably could have kept writing her that way for the entire show. And for a while, that first impression works. Then you spend enough time with Kyo that it starts explaining less and less of who she actually is. You've seen her in enough different situations by that point that going back to the version of her you understood at the beginning just feels incomplete. Sometimes 20 episodes can pass, and despite everything that's happened to a character, you still understand them in basically the exact same way you did at the beginning. That's when the archetype starts feeling reductive, because that first sentence still feels like everything the character was ever allowed to be. None of this suddenly appeared with Mao Mao or Frieren. Clannad was doing it years ago, Inuyasha was around even earlier, and anime had always had female characters who could start from something familiar and gradually become much harder to summarize. And yet, seeing so many of these characters show up around the same time still felt different to me. So why does this feel new? I think part of the answer is just timing. Frieren, the Apothecary Diaries, Dungeon Meshi, and now Witch Hat Atelier all showed up close enough together that what might have felt like a few individual great characters started looking more like a pattern. They aren't especially similar characters either, which is part of why I kept thinking about it. When I say fantasy anime stopped writing women for men, I'm talking about a kind of female character that can start to feel like a product before she feels like a person. You can almost work backwards from the reaction the audience is supposed to have to her. And after a while, you start noticing how much of the character is organized around preserving that reaction. With a lot of these newer fantasy characters, the person seems to come first. With Mao Mao, you get the impression the story figured out who she was and trusted, that we'd find something to like afterward. And if that's the order you're working in, you don't have the same constraint of constantly bringing her back toward whatever made her appealing in the first place. I think that's why Let Woman Be Weird kept sticking with me, even after Weird stopped feeling like a very good description of the characters themselves. The weirdness is almost a side effect. What changed for me was seeing enough fantasy anime do this around the same time that the difference became much harder to ignore. And after spending the whole video trying to explain why that feels so different, I think the answer is actually pretty simple. They feel human. And for more videos about characters who feel this human, click here for my video on the difference between being loved and being seen. Thanks for watching, like, subscribe, goodbye.